All right, guys, it is 5:30. We're going to get this started. And I'll get my notes up here. I just want to thank everybody for coming in tonight. We're still getting a lot of people trickling in, so we'll get this started. Just thanks for everyone for joining us tonight for the Alumni Night in History of Colorado virtual experience webinar. My name is Ryan Janisak, and I'm with the CSU Alumni Association. And I understand that this is weird times for many reasons, but we are just glad to have you here this evening. We will make this available later on, so in case you or someone else that has to dip out or something, you can watch it later at a later time on YouTube. I want to thank all our participants tonight. We had 78 RSVPs, so we're getting some more trickling in. I just want to thank so many of you. I looked at our list, a lot of members. And with those members, you help us put on events like this. I just want to remind you guys, this is a webinar, so everyone is automatically muted. Put any questions in the chat, and I'll ask those to Jeremy during our presentation today. Let's see. If you have any other questions concerning IT problems, if there's a connection not working, I'll put my contact info in the chat below for everyone. And then I'll also include a list of other virtual events that we are offering. Current events, past events, we have a wide array of things that you can view in the future and on our YouTube channel. Now, let's begin with our speaker, and I'll get my slides going. All right, so Jeremy is presenting tonight for us. He is the Public Engagement Manager for History Colorado Center here in Denver. He coordinates events, exhibits, programming at the History Colorado Center. Formerly, he was an education coordinator for History Colorado Community Museums. He will share with us the latest updates on the partnership with CSU and the different exhibits in the museum. He's also going to be focusing on his exhibit, Borderlands of Southern Colorado. Before transitioning to the Q&A and discussion, please put where you're watching from tonight. Put your year you graduated. We'd like to see where everyone's watching from. With that, I'd like to introduce Jeremy. Welcome tonight.
I can't seem to start my video here. It says the host has stopped it. You're stopping me somehow.
It says you're allowed. Let's see.
Oh, there we go. It says that. Let's see. Oh, there we go.
There we go. Welcome in, Jeremy.
All right, nice. I got my books behind me so you can see that I'm literate. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start my presentation here.
Sounds great.
I gotta share my screen first. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, so I just wanted to start by talking about who I am and what I'm doing here and what we're all doing here. So I'm Jeremy Morton, like Ryan said. I used to be the education coordinator at El Pueblo History Museum, and that'll factor in a little bit later in the presentation here because El Pueblo is kind of representative of the Borderlands story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Some of you are probably wondering, what is an education coordinator? What does that even mean? Basically, that means you design field trips and summer camps and things like that. You design all sorts of educational programming, but with local history museums, generally you're looking at 3rd and 4th grade students. You design field trips, you facilitate those, and you facilitate all the summer camps and things like that. I did that for about 3.5 years. Down at El Pueblo History Museum. That's one of the community museums for History Colorado, which is the state historical society. We actually have 8 museums throughout the state. I was going to go ahead and list them, but I always kind of blank a little bit. We have Fort Vasquez, who's unfortunately had a pipe burst over the weekend, so we're mitigating that. And we have the History Colorado Center in Denver, the Byers Evans House, which is now the Colorado Center for Women's History, the Healy House and Dexter Cabin in Leadville, the Trinidad History Museum, the Ute Indian Museum in Montrose, Fort Garland History Museum down in Fort Garland in the San Luis Valley, and El Pueblo History Museum. So we have all those museums throughout the state. I managed the education programs for all the community museums for a while. And then about 3.5 years ago, I moved up to our flagship museum, the History Colorado Center, where I'm now the public engagement manager, which is an even more confusing title. I don't even think I really knew what that was when I accepted the position. But basically what that means is I work on exhibits and events before COVID, back when we actually could do events like our CSU night. And I work primarily on the exhibits in our atrium space and our mezzanine. So I'm actually able to do more art-based exhibits than I anticipated with the history background. So that's the photo you see on the left there. There's a exhibit I worked on called Postcard Colorado, where we brought in a local artist named Chris Carlson, who did these giant 3D cyclorama wall paintings. So that's actually about a 14-foot wall there. Well, it's actually 2 7-foot walls on wheels, because we had to move those out. That's one thing they don't tell you about museum work. You end up schlepping tables around quite a bit and moving giant cyclorama walls. But anyway, that gives you a background for who I am and what I do. I did help a little bit with the development of the Borderlands exhibit, which is what we're going to focus on for this presentation here. Now, the main reason we're here is because the partnership between History Colorado and CSU. So we've had a great partnership throughout the years. I should say CSU's been a great partner to us throughout the years. I think we do some stuff like that for them, but really CSU has made a lot of some of our most essential programs and exhibits possible. Most recently, our Zoom In exhibit, and that's what this program is. It's part of our partnership on Zoom In. Now, Zoom In, if you haven't seen it, it's an exhibit at the History Colorado Center that opened in 2017, and it's basically an attempt to tell the entire history of Colorado in 100 objects. So it's quite an undertaking, and I have to admit that I was very skeptical when I was told that that was the exhibit we were going to do. I think because I had went to the Idaho State History Museum, and they had a very similar exhibit. My dad lived in Boise at the time, so I went up to see him, and I thought, oh, I'll go check out the museum. And I think theirs was called Idaho in 100 Objects, or Idaho A to Z, or something like that. But it was basically 100 objects to tell the story of Idaho. And it was just really bad. I didn't like it. It seemed like just a bunch of tchotchkes in a room, and it was like fluorescent light, and it was too bright. And so then I came to a meeting, and they say, we're going to do a 100 objects exhibit. And I was thinking, oh no, why are we going to do that? But really what ended up happening is a very beautiful exhibit. I'm very impressed. I wasn't a big part of the planning on that, which is another reason I was skeptical. but another exhibit developer we have named Julie Peterson just did an amazing job on it, and it's usually reviewed by our visitors as their favorite exhibit. It's just really elegant and beautiful, and there's so many cool things in there. A visit to the museum could be complete with just a visit to Zoom In. Yeah, so I'm a big fan of our Zoom In exhibit, and as you can tell, and that's a direct result of CSU. I'm not kidding when I say that entire exhibit concept could have easily been scrapped if it weren't for the sponsorship of CSU. So we're very grateful for that. And part of that sponsorship, we agreed to do one event a year for CSU alumni, and I was given the enviable task of being the point person on our end to facilitate that. So I do exhibits and events, and that led to me managing this program. In 2018, 2019, I worked with with Corey Slack, and now working with Ryan to do something for you all, and happy to be here tonight. And also it did lead to the highlight of my museum career. I met Cam the Ram. I think this is in 2018 at the museum. I'm still not sure how I convinced our collection staff to let a hooved animal actually into the museum, but I suppose when you're Cam the Ram, you get a little, I don't know, they're a little bit more flexible with such a famous quadruped. And here's a photo of, zoom in, the entrance right here. You can kind of get an idea with just the palette and the color scheme. It's just very meditative to me. I sometimes, if I just need to calm down, I'll go walk through, but you can see presented by Colorado State University right there. And this is actually a photo I found on the CSU website when I was preparing this presentation. So you can tell, I could tell at least, that this is a couple weeks before the exhibit opened, because you still have plastic over some of the artifacts there. Some of the artifacts don't have their text panel that go along with them. And also, unfortunately, I see a cup in the bottom right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but we got a Game of Thrones situation where somebody left their cup in the photo. You're not supposed to have beverages that close to the artifacts, but don't worry, I won't tell the collections team. But I also like this photo because, for this presentation, because it has a lot of artifacts that have to do with the Borderlands story. So this is sort of the first, I don't know exactly what to call it, not a hallway, but sort of first artifact wall. And there's a lot of artifacts that you could connect directly to the concept of Borderlands. You have this sort of fur jacket right here. That book in the bottom right, that's actually the Bent family Bible. This is an adobe brick mold that was used to build a church in the San Luis Valley. Retablo right here, common artwork with Hispano settlers. Toward the back there, you have a colcha, and I know it's there, but you can't see it. There's actually the pistols of the Espinosa brothers, who we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So the Borderlands story is an important story when you're talking about Colorado history. As you could tell, so many artifacts that are linked to the Borderlands story, and we had to pick 100 objects to tell the entire history. So it's a big part of Colorado history. All right, so that segues to the Borderlands of Southern Colorado exhibit. Now, this is actually an exhibit that originated, the concept originated down at El Pueblo History Museum back about 4 years ago when I was still down there. We knew we wanted to do an exhibit on the Borderlands. And that exhibit was eventually finalized after I was gone. I want to say 2 years ago or so. It's tough to gauge time in COVID times. 2 years, it could have been 2 years, it might have been 20 years, I don't remember. Time's just a construct to me now. So what are the Borderlands? So very basically, it does have to do with political borders. So in a lot of ways, Borderlands is self-explanatory in that you are talking about political borders in a lot of ways, or at least the way political borders have shaped people's identity. And one of the cool things about Borderlands from a historian perspective is that it really spans the duration of Colorado history. You could go all the way back to pre-European times, and the idea of a borderland would still be relevant, because you have the political boundaries being fought over between the Comanche and the Apache, and later the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in the area that would become Colorado. Later on, you get the Spanish, the French coming in, the Europeans start to colonize the area. And eventually you get the Americans and the Mexicans in the area. And that's really what we mean at the History Colorado Center and at History Colorado when we talk about the Borderlands. Generally, the era that we're talking about, even though Borderlands can be applied throughout history, as I said, generally the time you're looking at is the late 1700s through the mid 1800s. And really, I don't want to call it the climax because it's kind of too kind of a word for it, but for lack of a better word in my head right now, the climax of that is the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. A lot of people don't realize that the border between the United States and Mexico actually used to be right here in Colorado. And you can see that really well in that middle map there. It says 1848. Oh, unfortunately, you do get Texas trying to get up here for a little bit. Unfortunately, no, I have to give Texans a hard time because I have a lot of family in Texas. So if I have a chance to rag on Texans, I always do. So they unsuccessfully tried to claim the area. 1848, you have the Arkansas River right here in the middle. So that was the border between the United States and Mexico. And in a lot of ways, when we talk about the borderlands, we're talking about south of the Arkansas River there. So it does have to do with actual borders, but really when you're talking about borderlands, you're not really talking about physical borders. I think a lot of people, when they hear the term borderlands, probably think like, oh yeah, Colorado is a square or a rectangle. Rectangles are squares. I don't know. But I think that's where a lot of people's heads go is like, oh, how did Colorado become a square? That's not really what we're talking about. I've had that happen where I brought up borderlands to people and usually they ask me if I saw that History Colorado or History Channel documentary about how states got their shapes. That's not really what we're talking about. We're more talking about the people within the borderlands. And if you want to learn about borderlands, I would highly recommend reading this book by a philosopher named Gloria Anzaldúa. And she gives a good definition of what we at History Colorado mean by borderlands. Basically, we're referring to a geographical area, but we're actually referring to the people within that geographical area that are susceptible to la mezcla or hybridity. They're not fully Mexican or fully American or fully Native American. It's a sort of melting pot of cultures, of influences, these people that exist sort of on the edges of society, on the edges of political boundaries, and are forced to create an identity that eventually becomes completely unique and completely its own thing. And really, they have to do that in order to survive. And that's what we're talking about in Borderlands. And that's the stories we're trying to tell, are the stories of people who exist on these sort of fringes of our political boundaries. And this, I think, is a good example of that. This is a quote from Anzaldúa, and I want to read it correctly. I'm actually looking on my other computer. I have two computers going on here. I'm very fancy. I can't see the top here to read the quote directly, but so I'm going to read it from my other computer here. And it says, to survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, be a crossroads. And that's what we're talking about. It's to live in the borderlands, to be able to survive, you actually have to sort of live without borders. You live at this crossroads, but that ultimately means you yourself have to be that crossroads of culture in order to adapt to the people you meet, to the society that you have to live within. You have to actually sort of become the borderlands. And that's what Anzaldúa is getting at with that quote there. And that was actually the inspiration for an exhibit I worked on. As I mentioned earlier, I work a lot on our mezzanine exhibits. And that leads to a lot of art-based exhibits that I do. And this is from an exhibit I did, again, tough to gauge time, I think 2 years ago now, called Without Borders, or Arte Sin Fronteras. And it was all about how identity is forged within these borderlands. And I think, and this is a photo from that exhibit, and I think this encompasses what we're talking about in a sort of modern form. Because what you have here is a 1985 Chevy El Camino, which is often associated with lowrider culture, which is predominantly Hispanic culture. But the body work is inspired by Tewa black on black pottery. And the bodywork is done by Rose Simpson, who is of European descent, but has lived her entire life in the American Southwest. So you have an infusion of all these cultures coming together to create something that, in my opinion, is entirely new, entirely different. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the Borderlands. I think to oversimplify it, nowadays, we kind of refer to it as Southwestern culture, but I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. Also, I just love this photo. It's pretty awesome. Fun story, when I went to pick this up in Taos from the artist Rose Simpson, she was actually keeping it in her chicken coop. And I was like, oh my gosh, I thought she, I was all ready to go to her studio, and I just met her at her house, and she had this in her chicken coop. And I was like, wow, beautiful artwork. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about what the Borderlands are, I want to actually shift and talk a little bit about El Pueblo. I want to do this in part because that's where my area of expertise lies. I wouldn't consider myself a Borderlands scholar. For our exhibit, we actually gathered a symposium of Borderlands academics that informed the stuff that you read within the exhibit. And I was a small part of that. But yeah, again, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on the Borderlands of the United States or the Borderlands of Colorado, but I do know quite a bit about El Pueblo Trading Post because as I mentioned, I was the education coordinator down there for 3.5 years. And I think that El Pueblo Trading Post it encompasses a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of the Borderlands story, and not just Borderlands, but really Colorado history in general is represented at El Pueblo Trading Post. Now, El Pueblo Trading Post started in 1842. Basically, it's an offshoot of Bent's Fort. In the previous decade on the Santa Fe Trail, you have Bent's Fort, and it's a very successful trading post, and a lot of people see that, and a handful of entrepreneurs recognize that there's an opportunity here if they start their own trading post on the Arkansas River, the confluence of the Arkansas River and the Fountain Creek in what eventually becomes Pueblo, and that's called El Pueblo Trading Post. Now, nobody actually knows exactly what El Pueblo Trading Post looked like. You have some descriptions when you read about it. The descriptions are not flattering. It's always like, I can't believe people live here. This seems terrible, stuff like that, to paraphrase. And there's no agreed upon description. A lot of what we know is based on this Quisenbury sketch that you can see on the right here. And then we have this a theory of what it might have looked like on the left, basically the sketch of what the trading post would have looked like. It used to be called Fort Pueblo, but they don't call it a fort anymore because there was really no way to defend it. I think the walls weren't much higher than 6 to 8 feet tall. And the Utes make it very clear that this place couldn't really be defended. So really it was a trading post. And the reason it's representative of the Borderlands is because you have all types of people in the area coming to El Pueblo Trading Post, living peacefully together, trading, doing their best to survive in this frontier, in this Borderlands. You have the people who start the trading post, which are American and European settlers, along with Spanish-speaking settlers coming up from the South. Those people are always at the trading post. You also have Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho tribes coming to the trading post. You have mountain men. You have American settlers coming from the West. All these people are coming to the trading post, and they're forced into a situation where they have to adapt to all these different cultures, all these different influences. And ultimately, what ends up happening at El Pueblo and at Borderlands in general is it ends up defining an identity all its own. I think I was trying to think of a good comparison. This really hasn't happened very often in American history, where you have all this merging of different cultures that creates something new. The best comparison I could think of was sort of Cajun culture, where you have Caribbean and African and French and American cultures all coming together to form this new Cajun identity. I think is a good comparison. You have the same thing going on here in Colorado, and we're calling it the Borderlands. Ultimately, one other thing, checking my notes here. Another interesting and a different group of people that pass through, interesting story, is the Mormon battalion passes through El Pueblo trading post on their way to Utah. So in the winter of 1846, they wisely decide not to cross the Rocky Mountains during the wintertime, and they decide to set up camp near El Pueblo trading post, and they live peacefully with the people that are at El Pueblo trading post. They trade goods, they trade ideas, a lot of the dry land farming techniques that the Mormons had. A lot of people credit that to what they learned at El Pueblo trading post. Ultimately, El Pueblo does not end well. It survives the Mexican-American War. It's not like Bensport, which is abandoned during the Mexican-American War. But on Christmas Day, 1854, a band of Utes attacks the trading post, and most of the people that are there are killed or captured. And ultimately, El Pueblo trading post is abandoned. And although that's a sad story, it's also a great representation of the Borderlands again, because you're talking about the fringes of society. So even though we're talking about what's the United States, it's, well, proclaiming that you own something is a lot different than controlling something. So who really controlled that land? That day the Utes did, obviously. So I think that's a great representation of how people do whatever they can to survive within the Borderlands. Ultimately, the trading post, after it's abandoned, it sort of gets lost to the sands of time and buried and broken down. It was made out of adobe. And then in the late 80s, early 1990s, an archaeologist named Bill Buckles sets about trying to find the original trading post, and he digs deep underground underneath the Ferris Hotel, and about, I want to say 6 to 8 feet deep underneath the ground, he actually finds adobe bricks, and that's how they located the original El Pueblo trading post. That's still preserved near the El Pueblo History Museum. And just across the way from the archaeological dig site, History Colorado went ahead and built an adobe reconstruction of El Pueblo trading post. So this is where I did a lot of my field trips back in the day. And like I said, nobody really knew exactly how El Pueblo looked, but I think this is a pretty accurate imagination of what El Pueblo trading post could have been back in its heyday from 1842 to 1854. Oh, and there is me down at El Pueblo trading post. Like I said, a big part of my job was field trips, and I was lucky in that a lot of parents like to take photos of their kids during field trips. So when I left, one of the teachers actually brought me a bunch of these photos. That's where most of them came from. So yeah, nowadays we're lucky in that we're able to bring to life the Borderlands, bring to life El Pueblo trading post by taking school children through the trading post. They get to make their own tortillas over a live fire, play a trade game like would have been played there. We do all sorts of stuff. The mud bath, I don't know if they do that anymore. That was a lot of work. But we had a water week on one of our camps, and I thought I better dig these kids a mud pit. And then we made adobe bricks with some of that mud there. The bottom left there is actually Trinidad History Museum with the Baca house behind it. Those are kids holding up hands covered in adobe. I think that's actually a great story related to the Borderlands as well. I don't want to take up too much time because I know I have a limited amount of time, but Trinidad History Museum also connects very well to the Borderlands. You're talking about the Santa Fe Trail, and behind the kids' hands there is actually the Baca house. And the Bacas are a family that really, you could say, are defined by the Borderlands, or in return help define the Borderlands. And at El Pueblo, I wanted to pick two people to highlight from El Pueblo. These are people that are in the exhibit, the Borderlands of Southern Colorado exhibit that had a big part of the founding of El Pueblo. So Teresita Sandoval was the most well-known woman of El Pueblo Trading Post, and she lived there for pretty much the duration of the trading post and was known for basically being the person who held it all together. She was also known for being irresistible and beautiful. This is the only image that's actually known of Teresita Sandoval. One of the things that we tried to do in the Borderlands exhibit was really highlight the strong women who survived in the Borderlands. I think, unfortunately, for historians and especially for museum exhibit developers, so much of what you talk about is actually defined by quantity. You know, what journals you have, what texts you have, what photos you have, what artifacts you have, and a lot of times that informs what you're able to talk about. And as you can imagine, a lot of times that leads to people that played important roles in history being neglected. And I think that happens with the women of the Borderlands often, just because there's a lot more on Kit Carson than there is on Josefa Harmio Carson. You know, there's a lot more on Matthew Kincaid and than there is on Teresita Sandoval when you talk about El Pueblo Trading Post. But really, if you showed up at El Pueblo Trading Post back in the 1840s, odds are Teresita is going to be the one you remember. Another person well known for the founding of El Pueblo Trading Post is James Beckworth. Here's a quote from his autobiography that he wrote about 20 years later. He's considered one of the first people to go to El Pueblo Trading Post and one of the very first to write about El Pueblo Trading Post. He's a great representation of the Borderlands as well, because we're talking about doing whatever you can to survive, adapting your identity to survive within a society and within a culture. And James Beckworth is really the epitome of that. He's a former slave, freed slave, who then ventures out west and becomes a mountain man, and later a gold miner. He's a survivor, and he's one of the well-known people from El Pueblo Trading Post as well. Now, what we're talking about when we're talking about the Borderlands, like I said, are the people. Now, this is a photo within the exhibit here, and this is what comes after the Mexican-American War. So this is a photo, I want to say, from 1884 by William Henry Jackson, a famous photographer here. And this is from Old Town Pueblo. We're talking about Goat Hill and Smelter Hill. And I love this photo because it's representative of, you know, how close you're living. Well, one, it's representative of the actual people, the common people that are living within this area. And it's also representative of how close you're living with these people. So it's not like today's society where you could maybe theoretically isolate yourself and you know, choose to maintain your own culture. You're living shoulder to shoulder with all these people, and that leads to fluid boundaries of identity between people. And since this photo is taken in the 1880s, you know, generally where I've mentioned Mexican, American, and Native American, but really you're also talking about those waves of European immigrants that come in the late 1800s. You have Italians, in Pueblo at least, primarily Italians and Eastern Europeans that you're talking about. So all these different cultures are coming together again to merge to form something that becomes entirely unique, which is now what we see in Southern Colorado. And it's just such a great photo. I was like, oh, it's not big enough. I'm gonna do another slide so they can see it a little bit better. So I'll just leave that there for a couple of seconds. But yeah, it's just an amazing photo. All right, so I've talked a lot about the people, but part of the reason that Zoom In is such a great exhibit is because it's object focused. I think when the History Colorado Center was first opened, it was very focused on interactivity in our exhibits, and what I mean by that is we wanted to do things that place people within the exhibit, you know, it's actual physical things that they would do to help bring the story alive. And I think in a lot of ways, the collection was neglected. You know, we have about 1 million objects. And I think in a lot of ways, the people who developed those exhibits maybe forgot that, you know, part of the reason a lot of people come to history museums is to see cool old stuff. So like me included. And this is, so I wanted to bring that back in. You know, as a exhibit developer, we're more focused on the stories of people, and okay, how do we tell this person's story and how do we bring this person to life? And I want to tell about this person. And you sometimes you lose sight of how important the artifacts are, and sometimes like how cool it is just to see an old Spanish sword blade from the 1700s. So zoom in, what that did for us is it created an exhibit that was more artifact focused. You know, a lot of times there's really kind of two ways to look at an exhibit. You can say, okay, I know the story I want to tell, and let's find some artifacts to help us tell that story, which is usually how it goes. Or you could say, we have this really cool artifact. What story can we tell? You know, so that we could get it in the museum. And, you know, obviously exhibits go both ways at different times, but I would consider Zoom In more of an artifact focused exhibit. So it's like, okay, we have these, you know, we have the Espinosa pistols, we have John Denver's guitar, you know, how do we get those in a story? And what Zoom In allowed us to do was actually get some of those objects that maybe wouldn't fit into a larger narrative, but can exist within Zoom In. So tangent a little bit, but this is one of the cool artifacts from the Borderlands of Southern Colorado exhibit up at El Pueblo History Museum. This is an old Spanish sword blade of the 1700s that was later dug up in, I want to say, the 1930s by a farmer. So I think those two stories combined are a great representation of the Borderlands, because you have the Spanish influencing the area, and then hundreds of years later, an American farmer, you know, using his tractor to pull up this sword blade. That's the type of conglomeration of culture that you get. These are two of the cooler artifacts within the exhibit here. Now, the Espinosa brothers, Pataka and Spurs. It says alleged because one of our artifact curators is a very skeptical person, but this was brought, I don't remember the date that this was donated to the collection, but it basically was found by a Fort Garland merchant, or he decided to donate it to the museum. And there's no really reason to not believe him, but and it based on everything, it seems like these belong to the Espinosa brothers. But James Peterson, he's our artifact guy, our collections guy, he's like, it's better to say alleged, because, you know, we don't know 100%, but odds are these are the Espinosa brothers, Pataka and Spurs. Now, the Espinosa brothers are a great Borderlands story. I mean, it's a very sad story, but it's representative of the Borderlands, because what you have here are two brothers after the Mexican-American War, and from their perspective, they had six family members that were killed during the Mexican-American War by the United States government, and they vowed revenge. And then in the 1860s, they went on a killing spree. Nobody's quite sure how many people they killed, but I think they admitted to 30 something themselves. And like a lot of Old West outlaws that you see, to some people, they became folk heroes. To a lot of the Hispanos that had lived in the area before the Mexican-American War, you know, the people who would say, I didn't cross the border crossed me, they became these folk heroes. They became these people who stood up to the dispossession, the disenfranchisement that was going on. They're the ones who stood up to the huge government and power that was oppressing them and taking their land. And then on the other side, from the Americans' perspective, you know, these are criminals that need to be hunted down, and they're murderers. So yeah, I think you could kind of think of them, it's not the best example, but maybe like a John Dillinger or something like that, where, when people are in difficult situations, sometimes the outlaw becomes a hero. And also in Zoom In, I've alluded to it a couple times, but the pistols of the Espinosa brothers are within the Zoom In exhibit. And another excellent artifact from the exhibit is the San Luis Valley colcha. So this is a colcha, which is basically a quilt, but it's an artistic quilt done back in the 70s and by an artist named Tiva Trujillo. And it's all of the San Luis Valley embroidered into this colcha. It's really a beautiful artifact. It's definitely an art piece as opposed to like a practical colcha. It's only about 2.5 feet by 2.5 feet, but it's one of our favorite artifacts that we have, and it's just a beautiful piece. And you can see a lot of the San Luis Valley and just the details that this artist put into this. It's really a beautiful piece, and we're just thrilled to be able to display it. With lots of fabric based artifacts, though, it's a lot of maintenance. So I know, every few months the collections team has to take it down and service it.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yeah.
On the last slide with the spurs, what is that object on the left?
So that's a pataka. Basically, that's a chest. It's just a chest of items. Basically, what happens with the Espinosa brothers is they're hunted down. The U.S. Cavalry hires a frontiersman named Tom Tobin. And there's, according to Tobin, he tracked them down and there was a bounty on their head, and he killed the Espinosa brothers at their campsite. And then this is what was at their campsite. Other people from the Hispano perspective would say Tobin was actually a trusted friend, and they let him in, and then once they had fallen asleep, he killed them.
Perfect, thank you.
So I wanted to close. So those are the artifacts I decided to highlight coming to the end here. I did want to draw some attention to Josefa, Harmio Carson here. She's another one of the Borderlands women that we highlight within the exhibit. One, I wanted to highlight it just because I think this is such a great picture. I think her eyes alone kind of give you an idea of the hardness of life within the Borderlands and what it took to adapt and survive within the Borderlands. But I also wanted to do it for kind of a shameless plug, which is a program that I run called Recipes and Recollections. This is something my girlfriend and I run. Each month we use our History Colorado cookbook, and we cook a recipe and we upload it to our YouTube channel exclusively for members. But next month it's going to be a recipe called Tarejas, and it comes directly from Liana Wood, who was the granddaughter of Josefa. So yeah, check out our Recipes and Recollections and learn a recipe that most likely came down from Josefa here. And finally, here's some photos of the exhibit. The Borderlands exhibit. At the end there's actually a fourth woman. Those giant photos. That's one of my favorite parts of the exhibit. There is these giant photos of those frontier women, because like I said, so often that story is neglected. But if you really think about it, just from an objective perspective, obviously those are the people that made the frontier, that made the Borderlands, and their story should be told more frequently. And we did the best we could to help tell their stories and bring them the attention they deserve. Also, we have a 38-star Colorado flag there. It's actually a recreation, but it's pretty old recreation. I want to say from the 1800s. I'm not 100% sure on that, so don't quote me. So eventually that's becoming an artifact in and of itself. It's funny how recreations eventually become artifacts on their own. But yeah, so come down to the History Colorado Center, visit Borderlands, visit Zoom In, check out the rest of our exhibits. We have another exhibit that opened actually 9 days before Borderlands. That was a feat by our design and production team and our exhibits team to get 2 exhibits open in 9 days. But the Apron Chronicles also just opened recently. And then in May, we have another exhibit coming called Building Denver, which is all about the built environment of Denver and how that shaped our identity. as well. And that's all I got.
Cool. We got some questions coming in. One was about the Espinosa brothers. Were they part of a bigger movement such as the Los Manos Negros, or were they just renegades?
Based on what I know, they weren't part of a larger movement, but I wouldn't consider myself an expert on the Espinosas either. A lot of the stuff that we know about the Espinosas is sort of clouded and folklore. It depends on who you ask. I know that some reports say that they led a larger gang, but I'm not sure. I'm not really familiar with what was referenced there.
Cool. And then we have someone that mentioned they are a member. Where did they find those recipes and recollections?
So we send out a member email once a month, and they're linked in the member email.
And then right now with COVID, do you have to have reservations to come in and visit?
Yes, I think you do. It's always better to make the reservation in advance. I think if you show up, as long as that we're not at capacity, you could get in, but I think it's highly recommended that you make reservations online in advance.
Cool. And then let's see. Is there any other exhibits coming up that you look forward to that everyone should know about in the future?
Our next big one's going to be Building Denver. So that'll, if you're familiar with the museum where American Democracy recently was, our Smithsonian traveling exhibit, that's going to be Building Denver. So that'll be our next real big exhibit, and really the entire museum's going to be shaped into this whole initiative of Building Denver. So I'm working on several exhibits of my own. In the atrium, we were working with University of Colorado Denver architecture program. I don't know if CSU has an architecture program, but UCD architects are building a 5 points exhibit within our atrium. We have a Museum of Memory exhibit opening in the spring that's focused on the 5 Points neighborhood and the oral histories we've collected in the 5 Points neighborhood. I'm opening an exhibit. Actually, the first exhibit for the initiative will open next Friday. A smaller exhibit. These are our mezzanine exhibits, but it's called Black in Denver. It's a photography interview based exhibit from a local artist named Narkita Gold, who's interviewed she's probably interviewed 80, 90 people now to illuminate what it means to be Black in Denver. And we chose 9 of those photos to really blow up to a large size and help tell those stories. At the end of April, we have an exhibit that's retrospective. It's going to be called 30 Years of the State Historical Fund. That's a big part of our organization. We fund historic preservation throughout the state. We actually provide more money in historic preservation than any other states. Although a Texan may tell you different, theirs is, if you count courthouses, Texas is more, but they have a special fund that only goes to county courthouses. But we provide usually about $10 million in state funds to make historic preservation projects, and we've been doing that for 30 years. So we decided to do an exhibit to highlight 30 projects from the last 30 years. That'll open April 30th. And then on the 4th floor, another exhibit I'm working on is from a local photographer named Armando Hinero. And what I wanted to do with Armando, he has this amazing photography, and I really wanted to show people interacting with the city of Denver. So it's sort of adjacent to the Building Denver exhibit, which focuses a lot on design and the buildings themselves, although there's personal stories there as well. But I felt like it was supplemental to that story to have Armando in there as well. So long answer short, yes, there's a lot.
Let's see, we got some more answers trickling in, and sorry you can't see me. It's saying I gave you host rights, so it's not letting you see me right now, but
should I stop sharing?
Yeah, just stop sharing real quick and then there we go. There we go. All right. Should It's not letting me show my screen. Huh. Well, anyways, I'll ask you the questions and we'll get this going. Someone was wondering, how old is the El Pueblo Museum?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that the building itself now, I want to say it was 2001 or maybe it's the 2000s. It used to be in the old Pueblo airport hangar. And then at some point, History Colorado acquired it. God, I should know that. I think it was 2001. But yeah, the building itself is right down in downtown Pueblo off of Union and City Center Drive.
Cool. And someone was wondering, when does the Borderlands exhibit close?
It's actually considered a core exhibit. So what that means is there's no close date scheduled. So it'll be up for a long time. And also the exhibit down in Pueblo, that'll be up for a while as well. So if you ever make it down to Pueblo, yeah, I highly recommend stopping by El Pueblo. And yeah, you can see the border. They have some artifacts there that obviously we can't have them in both places, but like Zebulon Pike's sword is down at El Pueblo History Museum.
Very cool.
For a while, when Borderlands first opened, the actual Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was brought from the Library of Congress to El Pueblo. We have a recreation in the History Colorado Center exhibit, but the actual treaty was actually on display at El Pueblo for a few months.
And then someone was wondering, is there a way that they can get a copy of the Goat Hill photo?
Sure, yeah, I could. Oh yeah, I'll put my email in the chat here, and then any questions people have, or if you want a photo or something like that, I'm sure there's a way to find it through our website, but it'd probably be simpler for me to just send it to you.
Perfect. And oh, well, I think you sent it to me here. I'll put it in.
Oh, I see.
I'll send it to everyone. Let's see. Here's it is.
Oh, I see.
There we go.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the chat box. Yeah, so the recipes and recollections photo, it's kind of tough because we want to make it member exclusive content, and the way we do that is we make it a private link on our YouTube channel. So only if you have the link can you find the video. But that makes it kind of hard to find after the email's gone out.
Yeah, I was going to copy your address in there real quick so everyone has that. It went direct message to me for some reason. Let's see. All right. All right. Does anyone else have any questions for Jeremy while we have him on here? Well, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. It was great to have Jeremy present some of the amazing things that we're doing with our partnership with them. And we will be sending out a copy of this presentation as it is recorded, and we'll put it on YouTube in the following days. So feel free to send that out to people that could not attend and want to see something more about things that have happened in the past in Colorado. And it's just great to show the history of things. I just want to thank you again, Jeremy, for presenting tonight. This is a great presentation and something great to offer for our alumni in Denver and all over, from California to, we got some viewers from all over the place. We were seeing in the chat from, LA, another California. So it's great to have you guys in attendance tonight.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and you take care.